our first panel will be discussing the notion of a new world order, Russia's strategy on the international scene, and we will have three speakers: Kramer from Harvard University, Mikhail Troitskiy from MGIMO, and Viatcheslav from the University of Tartu, and our discussant will be Mikhail from the National War College. So I don't want to lose any time in reading their bio. You can access them in the documents you were given, and I would immediately give the floor to Mark for his presentation.
I prepared a PowerPoint for today, but I realized when I got here this morning that I hadn't sent it. So I'm going to make do with it follows very closely the text of the memo that I guess it hasn't been generally available, but it will soon be. And the idea of it is to look at the question of a new Cold War metaphor, which isn't new. Stephen Cohen used this in the late 1990s in a book that appeared, basically a full-scale critique of U.S. policy. I think a highly unconvincing one, but still it was used as early as that, and then has been used repeatedly in the years since then by many people, particularly since 2014, the idea of a second Cold War or a new Cold War. So this is a memo that critiques the use of that term, mostly because I think the analytical precision is important. The metaphor of a new Cold War rests on a conception of the Cold War that is invalid. It grossly overstates the magnitude of what is at stake available, and the reason that I think analytical precision is important is it's, again, particularly important to grasp the nature of U.S.-Russian relations, which for U.S. foreign policy are less important than U.S.-Soviet relations were. It's not to say they're unimportant, but they're a very different kind of relationship. So let me start from the mid-1940s through the end of the 1980s is roughly the period of the Cold War that I would date. And it had three underlying features. Unfortunately, it would have been helpful to be able to display these, but I'll go through them fairly carefully. First, two countries were seen as vastly stronger than other countries, and were therefore characterized as superpowers, the two poles in a fundamentally bipolar world. Of course, there were complications that emerged over the years with the emergence of the People's Republic of China, and then in European integration, which proceeded from the 1950s on, eventually took the form of the European communities, and then in 1992 the European Union. But despite those complications, it was a fundamentally bipolar world, and the two superpowers, as we know, the United States and the Soviet Union, were seen as far stronger than any other countries. Second, there was a deep-rooted ideological divide between the two superpowers, pitting Marxism-Leninism against liberal democracy. That, again, that ideological cast to the Cold War is another central feature of it. And third would be that large parts of the world, above all Europe and much of Asia, were divided into two rival camps led by the two superpowers. The bifurcation sparked, or at least fueled, highly destructive wars in East Asia, Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, and Central America. So those three features, if they're not present, it isn't a Cold War, because this is what characterizes the Cold War during that period. There are a few periods over the past 2,500 years that bore some parallels to the Cold War, but the period since 1991 or since 2014, whatever one wants to date for this new Cold War, is not one of them. All three features of the original Cold War and the one Cold War are absent now. For one thing, Russia has nowhere near the stature in the world that the Soviet Union did. China is now stronger and is widely seen as stronger than Russia is. The United States remains the dominant power in the world, and China is the rising challenger. Russia continues to have a large nuclear arsenal capable of inflicting catastrophic damage on the United States, and Russia's immense natural gas reserves afford a good deal of leverage vis-a-vis Europe. But Russia lacks the dynamism of China and cannot come close to matching the overall strength of the United States. Second, the only virulent ideology in the world now is radical Islam, which has no appeal other than among a minority of Muslims and has never been close to attaining the global following that Marxism once did. Radical Islam has nothing to do with the tensions between Russia and the West. The only ideology, or what I would describe as quasi-ideology, espoused by Russian President Vladimir Putin and his supporters is an incoherent amalgamation of so-called traditional values, including homophobia. Although Putin sometimes invokes ideological trappings for steps he takes, his only real ethos seems to be the consolidation of his own power. So the ideological overlay isn't there either. And then third, Europe is now almost entirely united in NATO, the EU, and other Western institutions. Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova have not been well integrated into Western structures, and a few countries in the Western Balkans have not yet been admitted into NATO or the EU. But there is nothing like the bipolar divide that once existed between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Nearly all of the countries that have not yet gained entry into Western institutions aspire to be admitted into those organizations in the future. So that's, looking at all three features, they aren't present now. So for precision reasons, I think you can discard the new Cold War metaphor, and so in the rest of what I discuss here, I go through and look at U.S. relationships with other countries since 1991, and liken those or contrast those with U.S.-Russian relations. Because I don't have much time, I'm going to go through these very quickly, but first look at U.S.-China relations. U.S.-Russia relations with Russia do have some important similarities to U.S. relations with China. China has sought to undercut U.S. hegemony in the world, especially in East Asia. Xi Jinping, through his One Belt, One Road initiative, has sought to establish a broad Eurasian economic infrastructure and trade network that will displace the United States, or at least be a major competitor with the United States. Although Japan, South Korea, and other major Asian countries have tried to put a check on China's economic dominance in the region, they have had to make greater accommodation with China in the absence of U.S. participation in the TPP, which the current administration backed out of last year, I think extremely unwisely. The Trump administration's imposition of trade tariffs against South Korea and Japan have also complicated efforts to counter China. China's desire to compete with the United States in both economic and military terms, and also in the use of soft power, however, has not resulted in a Cold War between the United States and China. There isn't an ideological competition between the two countries. There isn't a division of the world between the two countries. And again, they are not seen as superpowers in the sense that the United States and the Soviet Union were. Competition is present, but it hasn't produced a fierce, all-encompassing struggle. Russia lacks the economic dynamism and influence of China, but it too has sought to develop a rival economic bloc under its own leadership. The Eurasian Union is designed to be an alternative to the European Union, and also a means of limiting U.S. economic influence in the Commonwealth of Independent States. Then Russia has also sought more forcefully than China to use its own military forces in external military operations to compete militarily with the United States. Over the past 10 years, the Russian government has taken part in 3 foreign wars against Georgia in August 2008, and Ukraine since 2014, mostly through proxies, but also directly, and in Syria since 2015. It has pursued a large-scale military buildup and modernization. Russia has also carried out major military exercises, which have been well discussed by Ralph Clem, who is here in the audience, and in a forthcoming article, and engaged in military provocations and against member states of NATO. In all of these ways, Putin's administration has sought to project Russia as a military rival with the United States. So in much the same way that China's economic, military, and political rivalry with the United States is typical of great power rivalries over the past 2 centuries, Russia's attempts to compete militarily and to some extent economically are simply a competitive great power relationship. The competition is intense at times, but it lacks the severity, scope, and ideological overlay of the Cold War. Next, I go into U.S.-Iranian relations and U.S.-North Korean relations, again comparing it with U.S.-Russian relations. I think I'm running out of time, although Marlene so far hasn't signaled to me that I must stop. So I'll more briefly go through these. Over the past 4 decades, basically since early 1979, the United States has had a deeply hostile relationship with Iran, much more hostile relationship than with either Russia or China. Although Iran has far less capacity, and that has been true under every U.S. administration. It's not a question of party politics or anything. It has to do with a fundamental conflict between the United States and Iran. Again, I think largely driven by internal politics in Iran, at least as much certainly as anything external. Although Iran has far less capacity than either China or Russia to rival the United States militarily, in part because it doesn't have a nuclear arsenal, although it tried to build one. The Islamic regime in Iran has made maximum use of its military leverage in Syria and elsewhere, and has also sponsored terrorism in many countries as an equalizer. So, the U.S.-Iranian relationship then is an example of an extremely hostile relationship, as the U.S.-Soviet relationship was during much of the Cold War, even during times of so-called détente. But again, it wasn't a Cold War because the U.S.-Iranian relationship isn't a Cold War because Iran simply doesn't have that stature in the world that the Soviet Union did. And similarly, the competition isn't as comprehensive, and the world isn't divided between the two. It's again a question of a dominant power and a major regional power that are at odds with each other. And then finally, U.S. relations with North Korea, again, until this year had been a very hostile one for many years, going back to 1950, and then with the end of the war in July 1953. But it had remained at odds until the surprisingly friendly meeting in June of this year. Even now, however, there are major differences between the United States and North Korea. But again, it isn't a question of a Cold War. It is more hostile, at least again until this year, than the U.S.-Russian relationship was, but it didn't produce a Cold War because the other defining features of it aren't present. So let me conclude briefly by saying the relationship between the United States and Russia over the past 5 years or so has been typical of a great power rivalry and is best characterized as such rather than as a new Cold War. Great power rivalries can be relatively benign, or they can be tense and unstable, sparking periodic crises. The notion of a new Cold War is analytically helpful only if the 3 fundamental features of the Cold War recur in the future. That hasn't been the case with post-Soviet Russia, despite the surge of tension under Putin. So that's why that metaphor of a new Cold War obscures more than it reveals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Now I would like to give the floor to Mikhail.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk today about the politics of US-Russian arms control, and I have a few slides to distract you. So as we are drifting deeper and deeper in a crisis in US-Russia relations, we are indeed looking, or some are indeed looking, for anchors that could help us stop this dangerous dynamic. And so one obvious idea would be for such anchor to be arms control. And both Russia and the United States have played with that idea over the recent months, and we have at least informal expert discussions about the prospects for serious arms control underway. And Russia is apparently interested in discussing what Moscow calls strategic stability, sort of an umbrella concept meant to include everything from strategic tactical nuclear to anti-missile defense, conventional, high precision, space weapons, as well as weaponized cyber technologies and capabilities, and that because that could give Russia certain leverage over the arms control agenda. And so far the United States side has not been excited by those Russian proposals, but observers are still not losing hope for at least an extension of the New START beyond 2021, and eventually even more extensive negotiations on an arms control agenda. And of course, it is better to have arms control negotiations than not. But we should try and explore the chances for them to actually succeed under current circumstances. And for that, we need to understand the political conditions that used to be necessary historically for success of arms control negotiations. And I argue that so far, for arms control, that so far arms control was effective when both sides were clear about each other's mutual intentions. So when the sides in the negotiation were able to convince their counterparts before the negotiations of their stable intentions, then they could work from there and close some arms control deals. And what is interesting, those intentions need not be cooperative. They can also be adversarial, but at a certain stable level. So more generally, arms control agreements have so far been secondary to politics. Those agreements only happened when the politics of mutual relations was ripe for them, for those agreements. Now there are several competing conceptual perspectives on the dependency between politics and arms control. Some experts say that arms control, that moves in arms control, openings in arms control themselves can serve as signals about the readiness to improve political relations. So according to this logic, arms control decisions are made independently from politics and from the climate in relations between the stakeholders, the parties in that negotiation. Now, another group of experts say that arms control is a function of technological shifts and essentially is not connected with politics. Once you achieve progress in military technology, you want to dispose of your old arsenals that are no longer useful. So by arms control deals, the sides just simply jointly get rid of redundant weapons, but they would never compromise any promising weapons system or a system that is still under development. And finally, a third school of thought argues that the prospects for arms control breakthroughs actually depend on the overall dynamic of relations between the stakeholder parties, and that's where I belong as well. But even that approach has caveats. For example, there may be what is called destabilizing technology, that nuclear weapon powers, nuclear weapon states are tempted to develop and deploy just in case, to hedge against risks of their counterparts turning into adversaries. But despite those difficulties, I argue in my paper, in my memo, that there's one necessary and likely also sufficient condition that has always enabled arms control, even if it didn't go as far as to curb promising destabilizing technology. And that factor has to do with the clarity of mutual intentions. So arms control gets going and becomes successful after the sides have signaled and proved to each other their stable intentions. And what is interesting is that these intentions need not be cooperative, as I just mentioned. So the United States and the Soviet Union reached plenty of arms control agreements under global confrontation, right? Think of SALT I and ABM and SALT II and INF, CFE, and even START I. So the two sides were clear adversaries at those times, and at the times when they signed those agreements. But neither side displayed expansionist intentions, such as planning for surprise maneuvers in order to turn the tables. And when suspicion of such maneuvers being prepared began to grow, then Soviet-American arms control stalled. Think about the time, for example, between the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the ascent to power by Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, if you think about START II, SWORD Treaty and the New START, those treaties were signed by the United States and Russia under credible commitment to cooperation. Mutually assured destruction was there, it sort of lurked in the background, but it wasn't allowed to define the bilateral relationship. And these interesting periods that enabled successful arms control somehow occurred at the beginning of 3 consecutive decades. And now START II, of course, fell apart once the United States in the late 90s resumed discussion of missile defense initiative, and that was a move that Moscow viewed as a confirmation of changing United States intentions towards Russia. Okay, and the same dynamic was at work between approximately 2004 and 2009, and eventually since 2012. So those were and still are the times of intensifying regional rivalries between the United States and Russia, with a very high escalation potential, which makes credible signaling of intentions nearly impossible. And both sides are making declarations, of course, of their benign intentions, but they actually do not trust those mutual declarations because they suspect exploitation and subversion under the guise of those smokescreen declarations. And arms control has never worked under such circumstances, as I argue in my memo. So right now, and I'm about to finish, ambiguous mutual intentions are creating disincentives for US-Russian arms control. And what is even worse, Moscow and Washington now think of nuclear weapons as status-elevated instruments. That dynamic, that kind of thinking has always been there, but now it's sort of becoming more pronounced. So you think about nuclear weapons as a cover for creating facts on the ground. So Russia is looking to get freedom of hands and its policies towards its neighbors, and the United States has announced its intentions to build a bigger nuclear arsenal that is apparently meant somehow to bring political benefits. And however, the broader international community has been reluctant, historically been reluctant and unwilling to concede status on the pure merit of possession of nuclear weapons. So the international community is pushing back against such interpretation of the leverage that nuclear weapons give their owners, and that is forcing nuclear weapon states to raise the stakes even further. And finally, what can be done to stem this dangerous dynamic and revert to effective arms control? And of course, that's a $1 million question, and it warrants a whole paper, if not a book. But just by way of some hectic thoughts, if credible signaling of intentions is difficult at this moment, then the sides could at least verbally acknowledge the costs of conflict and the importance of the peace dividend, instead of praising the benefits of advanced military technology and showcasing it, in cartoons and so forth. So, reducing dangerous reliance and also reducing dangerous reliance on deniability in conflicts, I argue in the paper, could remove a major factor of uncertainty or mutual intentions, and from there you could probably push for a little arms control, which can then sort of allow more credible signaling and could perhaps usher in new agreements in the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. Would like now to give the floor to Viatcheslav.
That's all right. Thank you. Thank you, Marlene. Well, my presentation will also mention cartoons, but very different ones. It's a co-authored memo with two of my colleagues, whom I'm very much indebted in terms of formulating the main points. The point of departure here is the fact that Russia has often been accused of violating international norms, and generally speaking, normative disagreements have stood at the center of recent conflicts between Russia and NATO, Russia and the West more generally. And of course, the main turning point here was the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And the dominant view has been that Russia's attempts to justify its conduct are based on deliberate misinterpretation of universal norms and on outright lies. Indeed, in all of these situations, it's possible to offer alternative interpretations. There are important nuances, and it can be argued that Russia's view of international normative order is different, that view of sovereignty is different, for instance, and to some extent definitely does see its action as mirroring those of the West, in the sense that the West had violated sovereignty of various countries in the Middle East, and to some extent also Ukraine, as the Kremlin would argue. And then when Russia's concerns about that, Russia's complaints about that were not heard, Russia had no choice but to fight back. At the same time, it's hard to deny that in many cases, deliberate misinterpretation and deception and manipulation of the public opinion did take place. And probably the best illustration of that would be the little green man in Crimea in 2014, when I would argue that many people in Russia did realize, even at that time, that these were the Russian forces, but they didn't care, or even they sort of took pleasure in the fact that it was also carefully staged. And then when President Putin publicly admitted that these were Russian troops, there were no complaints and no reaction whatsoever in the Russian society, which is of course evidence that misinterpretation did take place. If you look at the opinion polls, well, the most recent ones are of course different, but that's probably because of the pension reform. But generally speaking, such strategy seems to be profitable and popular with the population. Quite often, especially when it comes to cultural explanations, and that's where we focus in our memo, when it comes to cultural explanation, people would quite often bring up the image of Homo Sovieticus, the Soviet legacies, something that has been inherited from the Soviet time. They would interpret such attitudes as manifestations of the double think typical of the Soviet personality, indicating the continued survival of these legacies. This approach, which is extremely popular not just in Russia, take the Levada Center and their publications, but also outside, I think it's vulnerable in many respects. First of all, because it doesn't specify the conditions for the survival of these legacies, and therefore it doesn't really tell us whether they're going to disappear and under what conditions they can disappear. And I would even argue that there is a very short step from this explanation to the essentially racist claim that en masse the Russians will never possess the public spirit required for a functioning civil society. One way of approaching this puzzle while still keeping the focus on culture, and this is what we try to do with my co-authors, is consists in contextualizing the cultural explanation by looking at the specific elements that might make strategic deception legitimate in the eyes of someone who at least grew up in the Soviet Union or within the culture that was inherited from the Soviet Union. So it's a thick explanation instead of a very schematic image of Homo Sovieticus. In an article published nearly a decade ago, the literary scholar Mark Lipovetsky pointed attention of the readers to the enormous popularity of the trickster figure in the Soviet culture, starting from approximately the 1930s. And what we argue in the memo is that the trickster, a character that skillfully violates rules and transgresses all sorts of boundaries, sometimes for no immediate reason, is a perfect fit, or the best fit at least, for Russia's behavior in these, under these circumstances. And to some extent, this archetype actually explains the popularity of such moves with the population. In terms of the examples of the trickster personalities, if you draw on the figures from different times, and Lipovetsky has a longer list. I think he doesn't mention Masyanya, and sorry about the language, by the way, just couldn't resist the temptation. You have, of course, Ostap Bender from Ilf and Petrov's novel, and several adaptations, film adaptations. You have Staruha Shapokliak, old lady opera head, and Masyanya is the most recent one, a cartoon character created by St. Petersburg artist Oleg Uvayev. There can be multiple possible explanations for the popularity of this figure in the Soviet Union, and Lipovetsky actually provides some of them. But we argue that one of the important aspects here, one of the important explanations, is the fact that according to the official story, the official ideology, the Soviet culture was created for the people and ultimately by the people. So the strong identification with the oppressed masses ultimately elevated the figure of the commoner, and especially the peasant, to the center stage of cultural production. And even if you look at the image of the founder of the Soviet state, in the mass culture representations, you would see him presented as a man of the people. His craftiness often is emphasized, craftiness in dealing with Tsarist authorities, for instance. Those of you who grew up in the Soviet Union would surely remember Mikhail Zoshenko's story about Lenin in prison, writing with milk instead of ink in the margins of the books, and then and the inkstand is made of bread, and then when the guard questions him, the everything is immediately eaten, and Lenin is happily demonstrating his clean hands. And of course, this also was, these motives played up in the underground folklore very much, where Lenin was presented as a cynical, witty character with kind and cunning eyes. Глаза такие добрые, с хитринкой. The real Lenin, of course, was a complex personality. And of course, there is the continuity between the Soviet culture and the Russian culture and the Soviet Union self-identity and the Russian identity is a problematic question. But at the same time, with all the talk about having risen from the knees, Putin's Russia still perceives itself as an underdog in its relations with the West. And it doesn't have the capabilities, probably neither the desire to revolutionize the current system, and tries to destabilize it from within. This is exactly what the trickster does. And the Soviet cultural legacies as such are a rich resource in subverting the international order, which in Moscow's view gives the West an unfair advantage. This resource is drawn upon, of course, not in any explicit way. Rather, it provides a cultural background shared by the ruling elites and the masses in ensuring the popular support of the Kremlin's foreign policy. Many people in the West are appalled at what they see as turning the rules upside down and playing dirty games with values which, it would have seemed, had been established once and forever as the sacred foundations of any civilized society. What they don't realize is that with some careful manipulation, the shocked faces might be made to look like those of the capitalists from the early Soviet cartoons, like here, for instance, or Soviet bureaucrats from the Ilfin Petrov's novels, but especially from the films, because the films make these characters much more popular. This is, of course, a very small functionary from the from Ilfin Petrov's story, but I think his facial expression, Alexander Shevin, great actor, is one of the best. There are a few more examples, but actually, a striking piece of evidence. I almost stumbled upon it here in this website, which tells you. I mean, it's a news source which tells you that Russia inflames a new conflict. This is the headline, and then one of the comments uses a Soviet poster from I think 1918. Yes, quoting Alexander Blok and the famous passage that to get the bourgeoisie will start a fire, a worldwide fire. This is an example of how this actually works in the political discourse, and in how we don't know whether it was a troll or a real person. I mean, a really motivated and sort of real patriot trying to defend his country against Western accusations. But as you see, it really works, and there is more work to be done on this, but I think evidence does exist, evidence of this type, maybe of other types, that these cultural resources are actually used in the current discourse. Yes, I'm actually almost done. So the only thing to say is that Russia's claim to once again represent the dispossessed and the oppressed of the world is of course totally fake. Contemporary Russia is an integral part of the existing neoliberal order, and its leaders are among the world's richest people. This, however, doesn't diminish the appeal of this claim, also beyond Russia's borders. The support that Moscow policies often enjoy among the populist forces, both on the left and on the right, is to a large extent due to the resonance between between Russia's trickster stance and the broader post-colonial agenda focused on real inequality and oppression. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viatcheslav. I'm now giving the floor to our discussant,
Let's see, I hate no, you did. I was going to say, leave the cartoons up there. That might distract. Okay, thanks. Now, first of all, thanks very much to Marlon and Henry for agreeing to have me and for the opportunity to take part in this conference and to look specifically at these great papers. The three excellent memos or papers that we've heard all deal with aspects or effects of the decay or the end of the post-Cold War order in Europe and in the world, and they address key questions related to the demise or the decline of this order and the emergence of a new one. I'm very much interested in this. This is a question that I've dealt with for the past 10 years as a practitioner academic at the National War College, chronicling and trying to understand the decline of this order, the emergence of a new one, and prepare American diplomats and military officers to deal with this. In my estimation, each paper poses an important question or set of questions about Russia's present place and role in the world, its relations with the United States, and its part in this order. In each case, Mark Kramer asks, what is the nature of this new order, Russia's place in it, relationship with the United States? Mikhail Troitskiy asks, what is the future of arms control in this changing order? And Viatcheslav Morozov and his co-authors look at the questions of how, why, and to what extent Russia is critical or disruptive of this order, and what is Russia after. Now, Mark Mark Kramer's paper on the new Cold War metaphor as a means of understanding the current state of U.S.-Russia relations captures the essential difficulty of explaining what went wrong in U.S.-Russia relations between the optimistic days of 1989-1991 and the shock provoked by the annexation of Crimea, the war in Donbass. This question of what went wrong is a basic issue which I've been looking at for years, participating in it, then trying to write a narrative account of it. I took several hundred more pages than Mark to get to what may or may not be an answer. But I think it is an essential question, and I believe his analysis demonstrates what I sensed anecdotally as a practitioner who has lived and worked in both the USSR and present-day Russia, that today's Russia is not the Cold War Soviet Union. And the relationship today between Moscow and Washington, no matter how bad, is marked by important differences from the US-Soviet rivalry of the past century. I also tend to agree with his argument that the characteristics of the present US-China relationship are probably most similar to those in current US-Russian relations, namely a form or kind of emerging great power rivalry. Now, while great power competition may be an accurate representation of the US-Russia relationship, or great power, regional power rivalry, however you want to make it more precise, this doesn't necessarily explain how and why this competition or adversarial relationship arose. Now, I accept his point that there is nowhere near as stark a dividing line today between East and West in Europe. But the fact that most of the European states are in either NATO or the EU or both, in fact, leaves Russia isolated and thus separate and divided from Europe in a different but very real sense. And this separation, this isolation, in and of itself may be a basic reason behind Moscow's alienation from Washington, its allies, and the post-Cold War order. Also, while there may not be an explicit ideological competition, Kramer's discussion leaves me wondering to what extent Russia's Eurasian integration efforts and actions to compete with or exclude Western influence from the near abroad or the Middle East represent rejection of the prevailing, if less obvious, US-backed ideology of liberal democracy and Washington consensus market economics. To what extent are we aware or unaware of our own ideology? Because we've grown up believing that and thinking that it's both scientific and correct. Mikhail Troitskiy's fine paper takes the uncertain state of US-Russian arms control processes and agreements today and examines what might be done to place both back on firmer footing and a correct track, or a productive track. In the process, he engages in a fascinating discussion of the classic chicken and egg question faced by analysts and practitioners alike. Does improvement of overall relations between countries facilitate reaching arms control agreements, or do successful negotiation processes and adoption of arms control pacts lead to improvement of broader relations between the parties involved? Now, I think the answer here is either yes or it depends, to dodge the issue, but his discussion of this dilemma leads him to what I consider the essence of his argument, the importance of trust or confidence achieved by unambiguous intentions reflected in clear signaling. In this sense, I agree with him. I believe he's correct in reworking an old adage and stating that countries do not need to be friends or to have good relations in order successfully to reach agreements on arms or other things. They need common interests, clearly perceived and accepted, and that are stable. I also agree with much of his final paragraph on the danger of allowing the present arms control architecture between the US and Russia to disappear. But you know, that paragraph and the paper doesn't, in my estimation, really answer some other key questions, such as what specific steps should one or both sides take and which one goes first? Unfortunately, I don't see anyone else on either side in this current relationship who has a quick or simple answer to these questions, although personally I think that there's one step and one answer which would be pretty prompt renewal of the New START agreement. And I don't see why that's so hard from the vantage point of this capital, but that's another issue in another paper entirely. I find myself in substantial agreement with his approach, describing a number of different types of relationships between the two superpowers and examining the arms control approaches and achievements in each differ or changing relationship. Although I might disagree with some of the characterizations in this analysis. For example, I would lump SALT I, the ABM Treaty, and SALT II together as steps to manage the adversarial Cold War relationship. While I see, and having been a participant at the time, I see INF, CFE, and START I all as part of a period where both sides were consciously trying to end the military rivalry and end the Cold War. And there are a number of places that one might quibble or work with this, but I think the paradigm that he's given us is one that's useful. I also wonder whether the adapted CFE treaty was a victim, not a victim of deteriorating relations, but rather of trying to get arms control to do too much, specifically to achieve unrelated or only loosely related political goals. The US-Russia or Western Russia disagreement over Russian troops in Moldova and Georgia dates from the early 1990s. But the use of the adapted CFE treaty to pressure Moscow to withdraw from Georgia and Moldova made the entire conventional arms control architecture dependent upon another political objective and could well be considered in this case a case of letting the tail wag the dog and contributing to the failure to achieve either end. Now, I really like the final paper by Mr. Morozov, Ms. Kurowska, and Mr. Reshetnikov, and not just because it takes me back to some of my favorite pieces of Soviet culture. I went to school there in the early 70s, went back and lived, and saw a lot of this stuff, not as much as those of you who are native Russians and grew up all the time with it, but I think it's important. I've long adhered to the general premise that some aspects of the behavior of international actors cannot be explained simply as the result of rational calculation. I mean, that may be trite, but it's something I think that a lot of analysts forget. And this paper, I find a fascinating attempt to use elements of Soviet and post-Soviet culture to explain both how present-day Russians and Russian leaders perceive the international order and how they respond and try to shape it. I myself have seen and experienced examples where Russians genuinely have a hard time believing that Americans or other Westerners really mean what they say and believe what they're saying about promoting democracy. I had a research assistant from a graduate student here at George Washington University, a Russian, native Russian, a few years ago, and we talked at length about this. And I could tell that he really found it. You guys actually believe this stuff. And I mean, it's a genuine difference. And to pretend that it's otherwise, it's not, as the authors of the paper say, just a smokescreen for a cynical strategy combining deception and manipulation. It's a real heritage of growing up in a different society and culture. You doesn't mean you can't bridge the gap, but it means there is a gap there that is due to other things than simply rational perception and plotting and other things like that. For example, before we get too self-righteous about examples of Russians accepting the use of disinformation, little green men, or do these pushkami or whatever, and approving of this, one might stop and consider how foreigners perceived explanation from U.S. government officials and analysts that the 2003 Iraq War was to eradicate WMDs, but when we didn't find any WMDs, well, it was actually to promote democracy, and it resulted in bringing greater freedom and human rights to parts of the Middle East. Yeah, this is not to suggest equivalency of the two examples to get into that argument, but simply to stress that mirror imaging in looking at actions of another actor will often lead us to incomplete or incorrect answers. I agree with the authors that Russia, and Putin in particular, question and seek to destabilize the present international order out of a perception that it gives the West an unfair advantage. As for the author's argument about the trickster, modeled on characters such as Ostap Bender, got it, and I'm actually probably going to fulfill that. From one of my favorites from post-Soviet culture. Well, there is a great deal to this argument, but I would add to it and ask simply whether there's also possibly still more from pre-revolutionary Russian culture. In other words, is this mainly, does these tendencies, these motivations or methods of action come from the Soviet legacy or from a broader Russian heritage which has been moderated and added to by the Soviet experience? I mean, I think of tricksters and I go back to Imperial Russian culture immediately, Chichikov, Klestakov. I understand, he's Gogol Ukrainian, well, he wrote in Russian, so I put him in Russia, although. But, and there are others. It's a question that I think bears investigation more broadly. Since the time of the Petrine reforms, and especially from the early 19th century, Russia has had a love-hate relationship with the West, specifically Europe. Russians wanted to be part of the European community and culture, yet resented the fact that many Europeans looked down on Russia as undeveloped, ignorant, backward, and the like. And I believe I perceive echoes of this conflicted relationship in contemporary Russian society, culture, and commentary. Irrespective of whether one agrees with all the details of the author's argument, I emphatically support their effort to seek sources of present-day Russian conduct in culture as well as political or economic interest. I know from personal experience, for example, in long conversations with Russian colleagues and friends during and after the 1999 NATO war against Serbia and Kosovo, that we have real differences stemming from our culture and upbringing in how we look at events, how we interpret the motives and the actions of participants in sub-events, and how and where we should apply norms that we share but understand in subtly and sometimes more than subtly different fashions. It's indeed extremely difficult precisely to define and describe these differences, particularly in any quantitative sense, but it is, in my view, therefore even more important to try to discern, describe, and understand them as an essential part in the process of properly apprehending and interpreting the behavior of our interlocutors. And there's much more to be said, but I'm out of time, and it's over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Will, for your great comments. We now have a little bit more than half an hour for the discussion, so there will be 2 mics in the room, and I will invite you to introduce yourself, first to wait for the mic, then introduce yourself and ask a question either to the whole panel or to one of the panelists in particular.
I'm Vladimir Kulik, honors member, Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. I have a question for Mark Kramer, actually a comment. You didn't specifically presented your criteria for choosing these points for questioning, for examining the adequacy of the Cold War metaphor. But I would argue that it might not so much matter whether it's bipolar world, whether the world is neatly divided into camps, and whether this relation is so important for at least for one party, for the United States, then maybe that this rivalry can be perceived or is increasingly perceived as to be pursued or addressed not so much by engagement but by containment. And in this case, it is adequately perceived, presented as Cold War. In contrast, I would say something which you kind of juxtapose with Cold War metaphor, namely what you called great power rivalry, is unproblematized presentation of Russia as an accomplished great power, which is something it seeks, which asserts, and which can be problematized no less eagerly, no less seriously. What makes Russia a great power? How much greatness is there? How much this greatness differs from greatness of the Soviet Union, and how much this greatness differs from greatness of China or other states claiming that status. So why is that we should problematize one and leave unproblematized the other?
I'm willing to take more questions too if
Okay,
you
we can do that. So we have, Chiro there.
Yes, if I could piggyback on that, because it's on the same issue. But the third paper is about the cultural dimensions of foreign policy behavior. One of the things that you laid out was basically an analysis which argues that as a geopolitical field, we don't have a Cold War. But as a geopolitical condition, we do have people who are entrepreneurially presenting the new Cold War. And Edward Lucas's book, he's a senior fellow here at SIPA. SIPA, the founder of SIPA, as you know, is Wes Mitchell. He's now Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasian Affairs. Lucas's book was published in 2008. It went through 3 editions. It's been translated into multiple languages. So it is presenting this particular conflict as an ideological one, and I would argue that you can contextualize that book and his whole agenda as part of a sort of what Andrew Preston talks about as sort of religious dimension of how the US approaches the world. You're not addressing that, and so I kind of wondered why you were not addressing the fact that this mobilizes. And I should just also say, on the Russian side, there's a website called New Cold War, which also sought to use this for Russian purposes, to kind of hype this as a sort of ideological, religious conflict of sorts. The website is now defunct, but it was certainly something that was a real discursive, affective fact, which I think needs to be addressed.
We had a third question there in the back. Yeah, Misha.
Hi, Mikhail Alexeyev, San Diego State University. And I want to ask a very short question. So, Mark, if we agree with you, and I agree that the ideological dimension is clearly not there, but is it precisely because we no longer have that kind of ideological clarity and two very coherent competing visions of the world system competing on the global stage? Actually, does it make the international system more dangerous? A system where intent is harder to read, and therefore arms control will be harder to reach. A system where tricksters have more play.
So let's take this first set of questions.
Could I add just 2 questions for each of my fellow panelists? First on with Mikhail Troitskiy would be arms control. I think it can actually be harmful to political relations if it is maintained, if agreements are maintained after they cease to be useful. The ABM treaty, I think, is a very good example of this. That it was a useful agreement during the Cold War because it would provide an element of stability in the U.S.-Soviet strategic relationship. When the Soviet Union ended, it ceased to be relevant, or it ceased to be useful. And in fact, it became an irritant in some ways in relations because at that point, the advent of technologies to develop limited ballistic missile defenses against other countries like North Korea and Iran, which didn't yet have nuclear weapons but were certainly aspiring to develop them, that that the maintenance of that treaty after 1992 meant that in 2001, in late 2001, when the Bush administration did finally abrogate it, it came at a bad time because the U.S.-Russian relationship had just improved in the wake of the September 2001 terrorist attacks, and the abrogation of that treaty seemed to be a slap in the face against Putin. So it's an example of when an arms control treaty can be harmful to relations if it's maintained after it ceases to be useful. And similarly with Slava Morozov, even though I fully accept the notion that you have to take account of the cultural relationship, I still think, and again, you aren't trying to combat this, but it understates, though, the extent to which political leaders in Russia shape public opinion about foreign policy moves. I mean, Syria would be a very good example of this. In July of 2015, the Levada Center did a poll showing how many Russians wanted Russia to intervene in Syria, and it was, I think, 14%. And then in November 2015, a month or so after the Russian intervention had started and was being portrayed in a very positive light in the Russian media, that percentage had gone up to about 80%. Now it's dropped since then, but again, it's an example of how easy it is on a lot of issues to manipulate public opinion regardless of culture. So let me briefly respond to the points that came up. In terms of the relationship between containment has often been regarded as a feature of the Cold War. In fact, the United States never subscribed to a uniform policy of containment. When Czechoslovakia fell to communist forces in February of 1948, the United States didn't intervene. In 1949, when communist forces seized power in China, the United States did not intervene. So the first two instances in which it was challenged, containment simply wasn't invoked. That even surprised Stalin in the case of China. He thought the United States might intervene, and he was relieved and quite happy after it didn't. And that was one of the factors that contributed to his decision to give the go-ahead to Kim Il-sung in launching an attack in 1950. It wasn't the only factor, but certainly the lack of U.S. intervention in China contributed. Similarly, in other instances, the United States pursued rollback, in particular in the 1980s under the Reagan doctrine. So containment was mostly a slogan developed by academic specialists and by policymakers who wanted to rationalize steps they would have taken anyway. The fundamental thing, though, about the Cold War that made it different, aside from the three features I noted, is that hostility has been a feature of U.S. relations with many countries, and that's why I did bring up the cases of Iran and North Korea, but particularly Iran. It's not a Cold War, but the U.S.-Iranian relationship has been much more hostile than the U.S. relationship with Russia, even since 2014. In terms of whether Russia is a great power, I'm using great power not to mean anything virtuous. I mean that Russia is a great power in the sense that it can affect international politics in a way that most countries cannot. That traditionally has been the definition of a great power, at least in the field of international relations. It's whether a particular country has disproportionate influence on international politics. And Russia clearly does have disproportionate influence in the Eurasian region. With regard to Ed Lucas, I've known Ed for 30 years or so, and he's a friend of mine, and I actually, on many things, have agreed with him. I just don't agree with his use of the Cold War metaphor. I think it grossly overstates the importance of the U.S.-Russian relationship. The U.S.-Russian relationship is important. It is simply not equivalent in importance, however, to the U.S.-Soviet relationship. And to suggest that it is presents a misconception of the current U.S.-Russian relationship. As I discussed, it is much better thought of as a competitive great power relationship that at times can be very tense, but doesn't have the ideological overlay, the bipolar division of the world, and the ever-present possibility of large-scale nuclear war that the Cold War did.
What about, Mikhail Alexeyev's question, I don't think it was answered, about being dangerous, about the current particularly dangerous, this lack of clarity.
Okay, okay. Well, I'll come back to it in the next round.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bill, for the comments. Obviously, we only have 2,000 words for the memo, so we outsource the 19th century story to Mark Lipovetsky's article, and Mark argues that the prominence is incomparable in the 19th century popular culture as opposed to the Soviet culture. There is definitely a longer story to be told there, which deals not just with the culture as such, but also with the social divides and the relationship between the elites and the masses, and how this played out then in the Soviet period, especially in the Stalinist culture, producing what we now have. And there is in general, there is many more dimensions of this sort of figure of the underdog or the peasant, which is extremely important, I think, for the Russian culture, including political culture. And also Chichikov and Reshetnikov, they're not really identified with in the story, right? Whereas someone like Khajana Sredin or even Ostap Bender are those characters which the reader actually identifies and empathizes with. Manipulation of public opinion, yes and no, because what defines public opinion? Do opinion polls, especially in Russia, adequately represent public opinion? And what do we mean by public opinion? It's a big philosophical question, but it's directly relevant in the case of contemporary Russia, especially when it comes to foreign policy moves, and especially to something which used to be irrelevant as Syria, and then becomes suddenly relevant, and people don't know what to think about this, so they naturally tend to side with the authorities. At the same time, the manipulative, it's my favorite argument, I made it many times. The manipulators under Yeltsin were no less skillful. Look at the 96, right? His popularity just surges, goes through the ceiling. So they were skillful, but they were not able to sell democracy to the Russian people on those conditions on which it was sold in the 1990s. And very briefly, if I may comment on the questions to Mark about discursive representations, I think it's important to look at discursive representations, and if there is a discourse of the Cold War, it needs to be taken into account. But then we need to look at the entire discursive field and at the relative prominence of these discourses, and whether we really can say that there is a genuine ideological conflict, or is there some people who are trying to present this conflict on both sides as a genuine ideological conflict, as opposed to something which is much thinner and in many respects much more pragmatic. So on that I would actually side with Mark.
Yeah, very, very briefly, thank you, Ambassador, for your excellent comments. I really appreciate it, and thank you, Mark, for allowing me to react to your question regarding the harm from sort of the arms control agreements that have outlived their usefulness. So the easiest way to react to that would be to say, okay, so you basically have two cases. You have a consensual dismantlement of an agreement, and let it considered to be an arms control agreement, but I think this point applies generally to any international agreement or even any international institution. So the point is, what does it take, or what do you need to dismantle arms control agreements at the consent of the participating parties? And perhaps to do that, you need more or less the conditions need to be the same as they need to be for the parties to sign to enter in such an agreement, and that would be the same transparency of intentions. So I think it only reinforces my point in the paper. What you said only reinforces my point. But if we are talking about unilateral abrogation of agreements, then I think, and then if you are talking about specific agreements that have outlived their usefulness, it means that you generally believe in the usefulness of agreements, including arms control agreements. So you're not like offensive realist or anything of that kind. And if you only believe that some agreements have outlived their usefulness, then from an institutional perspective, abrogating such agreements does come at a cost. And that cost affects the credibility of other agreements in existence, and also the contracting capacity of the parties that abrogate agreements. Okay, so the harm you are talking about of maintaining those agreements that have outlived their usefulness, that harm, I think, is exactly the cost that you pay. And the whole institutional structure, the order pays for unilateral dismantlement of those agreements. Thank you.
Let me say one more thing about the new Cold War metaphor. And the guy who probably has the greatest bone to pick with Ed Lucas's book is Mark McKinnon, the Moscow correspondent at the time of the Toronto Globe and Mail, who at the exact same time published a book with exactly the same title and didn't get anywhere near the sales. But the metaphor, I believe, also from my vantage point, we're working in the government, has a mobilizational effect. I remember when I was doing the Bosnian Wars in the early 1990s, testifying to Congress once, and they were badgering me after one of the Sarajevo marketplace massacres, is it genocide, is it genocide, is it genocide? They wanted me to say it was genocide because then they would have a handle to invoke the treaty, and these were advocates of American intervention in Bosnia. And I finally got so annoyed with them. I said, well, what, is it okay? You want me to say it's genocide? Is it okay if it's just mass murder? And the analytical description is one thing, but I think today, I look at this and I see there's a segment of those who use the new Cold War metaphor who simply want to mobilize their government for a certain policy relationship either with Russia or with the United States. And it's very hard to separate that from those who are trying to look at it analytically with analogy, a historical analogy, as a descriptive and analytical tool. But from where I sat for 30 years, I look at it as the political motivational tool. Sorry.
Let's collect a new round of questions. So we have two here on that side. Here. First and second round, just here, and then here.
Thank you, Vladimir Rishenko, Kiev Polytechnic Institute. I have a question to Vyacheslav Morozov, and I wonder if Russian denial of evidence that they indeed interfere in Ukraine and in other countries, is this really something unique and specific? And how is it different from other forms of widely known denialisms, like for example climate change denialism, that there is no climate change, or it doesn't concern the human actions, or like for example denialisms from Ukrainian side of the conflict, that there are no fascists in Ukraine, and if confronted with real examples of the veterans with swastika tattoos and making Sieg Heil, a very popular answer would be, oh, this is just a trolling of Russian propaganda, they're not Nazis, they're just trolling them. And so, is it really different? And if yes, in which aspects?
Thank you. Peter Olbrich, Irish. Just going back to the Cold War metaphor discussion, wasn't there, apart from the mobilizational factor, also kind of a demobilizational factor, that from the very beginning when Russian-American relations began to deteriorate, there was this argument, but this is not a Cold War, of calming down people who were worried about this confrontation, because there is no ideological component to it. Marxism-Leninism is no longer part of the of Russia, and therefore we don't need to look at it in terms of Cold War. It seems to me that if we name it ideology or philosophy or worldview, but a certain value aspect to the confrontation between Russia and China and the West has been there, and has been there for quite some time now. And so politicians of all colorations invoke terms such as Western values, European values, American values, recently John McCain in his last message, and they mean something that is not very well defined, but that is used as a rationale to explain why this conflict will be long-term and why it needs to be won. And so there's a motivational aspect there as well. But there's also a very strong conviction, I think, in Russia and China and other countries that they do not want to buy into what they perceive in this rather blurred notion of Western values, European values, American values, of the definitions that are in the air today.
Thank you, and we have a third question on that side.
Wayne Perry, the American Foreign Policy Council. Just a little addition on the business of arms control. One of the things that we do not see today that was terribly important during the decades of real arms control was cadres. I think people forget from the Nixon years right up to the end of the last century that there were vast numbers of people on both sides, not just in the diplomatic services, but in the military, the intelligence services, and most importantly here in Washington on Capitol Hill, members of Congress and senior staff who were deeply involved in making arms control happen and in our system getting it ratified. And without wishing to say that there's no human talent involved in arms control in the city today, I think you have to acknowledge that the bench is very thin. And that my impression is that in Moscow, their bench is deeper than ours is, but it's a lot thinner than it was back when arms control was a very going concern. And this is certainly important because not all arms control agreements are driven from political leadership. A lot of them kind of gestate from below. And I can remember many times when the White House was presented by subordinates with our progress on arms control, which presidents and secretaries of state were not enthusiastic about, but they fundamentally had to go along with the progress.
Thank you. So we'd like to give you back the floor. Let's begin with Slava.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm a structuralist or post-structuralist, whatever, but so I of course would argue that there's nothing unique about Russia or any other country in the world. But more specifically, yes, there are different types of denial. Actually, this trickster denial or tricksterish denial is not quite a denial. So it's like you actually know that you've committed something, you've done something wrong, but you enjoy it. And the question that we address in the memoir, and hopefully in a larger paper or maybe in a series of different papers, is how is it possible to enjoy doing something wrong? And trickster is our answer to that. And by the way, this image in itself is not, of course, anything unique to Russia, obviously. As I said, it's an archetype. More specifically, Russian propaganda, defining something as Russian propaganda in Ukraine's case, or defining something as Western anti-Russian propaganda in Russia's case, is obviously depicting someone as an enemy and antagonizing the enemy. It's a very effective strategy, but at the same time, mocking the enemy or mocking the other is sometimes much more, a much better strategy, and probably it doesn't have such serious consequences as direct antagonization. So even for pragmatic purposes, it can be more useful, although actually, again, I wouldn't argue that this is an entirely strategic choice. It's more like something that is largely culturally predetermined and then only at the superficial level played out. And there is this agential component where actors actually do something consciously. So the resources they have are of course given to them.
Yeah, I can just react to Wayne Mary's remark about the narrow bench of arms control experts and enthusiasts, and I think that the situation may be even worse because arms control has become an issue of lively political entrepreneurship, whereby for example, anti-arms control is being used to shore up support among bureaucracies or even achieve domestic mobilization almost free of charge. So at the very least, it has become politicized. So compromise is very difficult. So and only if you have the relative calm of both sides being assured of their mutual intentions, only then can you proceed with those bureaucratic politics of arms control that are depoliticized, sort of de-emphasized, and are proceeding largely at the backstage, with then the leaders stepping out of the shadow at a certain point when the situation is ripe and signing that agreement. And we are not seeing anything of that kind right now.
First, let me quickly respond to Mikhail. I agree with the point you made about unilateral abrogation versus mutual abrogation of a treaty, and that's where I see the ABM treaty as a good example of where mutual abrogation should have been, or mutual dissolution of the treaty should have been pursued by the Bush administration in 1992. And if not by the Bush administration, then by the Clinton administration in 1993. It undoubtedly could have been arranged with Yeltsin's government, and then both governments could have worked to develop limited ballistic missile defenses, which I do think are desirable. But the maintenance of it was simply a factor of inertia, and it's a good example of where ultimately it was left to unilateral abrogation at a time when it had an unfortunate impact. So with regard, I fully agree with Ambassador Hill about the mobilization component of the new Cold War. This is, I think, very evident in Ed Lucas's book, But again, I'm not a policymaker. I don't live in Washington. Have no desire to. One of my brothers has worked as a State Department official, but I have no desire ever to be part of the government. So I'm writing as an analyst to look at this from the standpoint of precision, and that's where I regard the new Cold War metaphor as misguided. But it's not just, even if you do want to influence policy making, you can argue that it grossly overstates the what is at stake in the U.S.-Russian relationship. And here I go to Mikhail Alexeyev's question. I'm not sure what you mean by more dangerous. During the Cold War, it was an extremely dangerous relationship. The two countries came perilously close to an immense nuclear war in 1962, in October 1962. There's been nothing comparable to that since 2014, and I think the notion that it's a more dangerous relationship simply is historically wrong. The Cold War contained that element of the prospect of a large-scale nuclear war. Forces were maintained to fight large-scale nuclear wars if necessary at a moment's notice, and those forces have been greatly reduced over the years, even though there is still very significant nuclear forces in place. But at the same time, the notion that somehow that it is more dangerous now because there isn't that ideological element strikes me as blind to the reality of what was there during the Cold War.
Well, we still have 5 minutes, so if there is a last round of questions, so I see one, suddenly a lot. Let's take these two questions, so the lady here and then.
Hello, my name is Milena Dercheva, and I've got a question for Dr. Kramer. I wanted to, if possible, maybe theorize, or where do you see the kind of ideological fallout going from where I stand? It looks to me like there is not well articulated, but nonetheless ideological resurgence in the East. So you see, for instance, Russia, China, Turkey kind of coalescing into their own kind of illiberal, I wouldn't say axis, but group of states that tend to have new rules of engagement with other states, and they stress statism, nationalism as their characteristics. But where does the West stand now? So the Trump administration has abandoned any commitment to liberal democracy or promotion of it, and it seems like there is ideological decline in the West. So where do you see that going? Thank you.
And Sarah?
Hi, Alexander Nomo from George Mason University. I have a question for Viatcheslav Morozov about the acts of Russian deniability in Ukraine and elsewhere. I'm thinking about what Mark Galeotti called these like nod and wink ads, where they say that they didn't do it, but everybody kind of knows about it. So who's the main audience of it? Is it the Russian domestic audience that understands this kind of background, these characters? Or is it maybe post-Soviet people in the near abroad, or is it Western politics? And do you think that's effective communication? And also, could you comment on the Salisbury poisonings and how you think those could go into the trickster idea? Because I'm just, again, going back to the movie symbols, I'm remembering the Bratz one and the scene where Viktor Sukhrukov's character arrives at the airport in the U.S. and he gives the long speech about, I'm here for the computer conference and so on. And then they comment after that, well, how gullible like the Americans are. And do you see any parallels between that and the way that Russians are interpreting the Petrov and Boshirov affair right now?
Let me first comment on with regard to I think that, again, the example that you mentioned about the efforts by Russia, China, to some extent Turkey, although Turkey's nowhere near the power that Russia and China are, so it's more of a add-on than a real participant in this coalition to counter U.S. power. Turkey does have the importance of being a NATO country, but in the oddity of being a NATO country. But it's again a good reflection of this is a great power rivalry. Those are two great powers that both have a desire to counter U.S. dominance in the world and undercut it. And at the same time, I think it overstates the extent to which there is the real potential for a Russia-China rivalry as well. And in fact, there is one to an extent already. The only thing that has brought them together is the sheer desire to counter and undercut U.S. hegemony. So I think that it, again, is a good example of why the Cold War metaphor is not helpful. Very quickly, the question of China is also helpful in understanding the cultural dimension. I had a graduate student a few years ago who had been educated in the United States at the University of North Carolina, and so when he came to me, he at one point we were having a discussion. I made this striking comment about because he in many ways had been very much acculturated into the United States. But he made the striking comment that he thought democracy was undesirable. So I was struck by that. I didn't really say too much to him at the time, but I asked him again when I saw him this year, because he had left, but he came back to visit, and I asked him again whether he still thought that democracy was undesirable, and he said, now I'm not so sure. So I think culture is durable, but it also can change.
Yes, on this last point, I would never argue that culture cannot change and that culture remains stable and so on. Actually, yes, there is always the potential, and what we describe in our memo, we treat as resources more as stable structures. In terms of the main audience, I think there are different aspects to this argument, and the nod and wink is probably mostly to the domestic audience, although to some extent also to the Western publics and sort of semi-peripheral countries. There is also this genuine, fake, but in some respect genuine positioning as an underdog and the speaker for the oppressed, which is more again addressed to the peripheral, to the global periphery or semi-periphery even more. But then of course there is also the post-truth dimension. I think many people in Russia, especially in the siloviki quarters, really genuinely believe that everyone lies and everyone deceives, and this is normal, and therefore no one really cares, and we really just need to put a nice face on and do whatever we want. So all these dimensions come together, and of course they can be combined individually in all sorts of ways. I mean, individual people can believe in all sorts of different stories. I think the Salisbury thing is more about the post-truth dimension, and if we take this story as it is presented in the West, then I feel that it's much more sinister and it doesn't really fit into our argument that much. And I'm really a bit puzzled with this Petrov and Bashirov tandem and what they wanted to achieve by putting them in front of the cameras and who they are really, and it's not clear to me. But I mean, the problem is that to the audience that has been brainwashed, any argument would be convincing. To the critical audiences, they might get puzzled, but at the same time, a large proportion of the critical audiences around the world will be also critical of the British story. So this is the actual flaw or sort of condition on which Russia builds its own defense and position in this case. But of course, we really know too little to be able to really say something meaningful about it.
Thank you. Well, it's already time for us